Hello, thank you for joining my presentation on best practice recommendations for designing usable and accessible online courses. Today I'm going to talk to you about course planning and design and then course delivery and evaluation. In terms of course planning and design, first of all, I'm going to talk to you about some information design strategies. Then I'll talk to you about some instructional design strategies, which also overlap with many universal design for learning or UDL strategies. So first of all, in terms of some information design strategies, many of you are probably doing these things already because you know about information design or usability or technical communication. So this will seem very familiar to you, but sometimes maybe we don't realize how important these strategies are, maybe to people who cannot see our documents, but maybe using assistive technologies, for example. So just to reinforce those important points, the first strategy is to use the built-in heading styles to format your Word documents. So this aesthetically looks pleasing to see the different colors and different font styles and sizes and so on. But it's also really important for people using assistive technologies, especially screen readers, because it will actually read out the heading style name to the users. So it'll tell them this is a heading 1 style or a heading 2 style, thereby conveying the hierarchy of the document to somebody who cannot actually see those styles on the screen. Okay? You should also, of course, try and incorporate images and tables into your documents, not only because, a lot of text can be very hard to process, but also because some people prefer to review visuals or they prefer to see complex figures presented in table format. So it will help people with different learning styles and different preferences as well. Also carefully consider your color choices. We know this is important from a localization point of view, but also in terms of, many people are colorblind or many people have difficulty perceiving certain color combinations. So be very careful with the color contrast that you use in your, your Word documents, your presentations and so on. And also then in terms of accessible links, quite often we write out the full URL for a particular hyperlink because we want the person to be able to see what the URL is. So I have done that at the end of my slides, for example, because not everybody will be able to click on the video link present in the presentation file. But ideally, if somebody is using a screen reading device, you don't want them to hear http://www dot and then a very long URL being read out to them. They will want to hear, click here to read more about the symposium on usability and design, and they will know that's a hyperlink, which they can then use their assistive technologies to access that link if they want to. But that's a much more appealing thing to hear being read out to you than the full URL. So that's what we mean by accessible links in documents. Some other strategies in terms of information design, you should try to remember to do accessibility checks on your Word and PowerPoint documents. Now I'm talking about, Office 365 documents in this presentation, but you can do many of these things in Google Slides, Google Docs and other tools as well. The functionality might not be exactly the same, but you can do many of these things. So one of the first things that you'll find if you do an accessibility check on your Office documents, it will remind you to add informative alternative text for all your images and figures. So I stress the informative alternative text, because sometimes we write very basic alternative text that is not actually very informative to somebody who's hearing it being read out to them. So make sure it actually conveys what is in the image, so they get the same benefit as somebody who can see it. You should also consider things like the reading order of the various objects on your PowerPoint slides. Now, this was something I was not aware of until I started doing accessibility checks on my PowerPoint documents. So if you think about a typical PowerPoint slide like this, you have a title bar, you have your main body text, you have an image inserted, you might also have a footer and a header, maybe page numbers and things like that on the document. So we might read this from the top down. Okay, but unfortunately, somebody using a screen reading device, it won't necessarily read it in that order. It may read the body text, then read the alternative text for this image, then read the title, then read the page number, then read the header. So when you do your accessibility check, it will tell you what the order is that will be read out to users, and you can adjust the reading order accordingly so that it reads it out in the order that you intend, which is usually top to bottom. Okay, that's a really important one because somebody using a screen reading device would hear a very poor version of this slide if it was read out to them. Another thing that I discovered recently when I started doing accessibility checks, I often have instructional lab sheets written in Word documents, or I have, PowerPoint presentations where I have screenshots of software applications. And I often will draw other shapes on top of those screenshots to highlight different parts of the interface. When I'm looking at that, I can see that I've highlighted this particular button on the interface or whatever. But somebody using a screen reading device will actually hear, first of all, the alternative text for that screenshot being read out to them. But then if you haven't added alternative text for all those shapes, the name of those shapes will also be read out. So they will hear auto shape 1, auto shape 2, and auto shape 3 if you have drawn 3 circles on top of that screenshot. Okay, which obviously that's not a bit informative to them. So you need to think carefully about how you will convey what it was that you were conveying in the visual to somebody who cannot see the visual. Okay. And another thing to think about, try to always create PDF versions of your Word and PowerPoint presentations as well. And not everybody has Word and PowerPoint installed, but also because when you create a PDF, it kind of firms or confirms the design and layout that you wanted to, and it doesn't start adding in different page breaks and things like that. So it preserves your formatting. And also it can be opened up in browsers and pretty much anybody can access those kinds of file formats. Just in terms of instructional design and universal design for learning, some things that you may be doing already, but just to reinforce them, it's really useful to chunk your course materials into like weekly folders or themed folders if you don't want to separate them by week. This helps learners navigate through your course materials and also understand them. So if you're using a learning management system like Moodle or Blackboard or Canvas, you can create folders and subfolders and organize your materials so that people know each week what it is that's expected of them. You should also try to use a consistent format for your weekly materials. And this is a good usability practice as well, because when people become familiar with what you're doing, they spend less time focusing on the layout of your documents and they spend more time focusing on the content of your documents. If students find that every week the materials are presented inconsistently, they will struggle with kind of understanding, is this important? Is this less important than last week? And so on and so forth. Also remind people about what they have done before that's relevant. We often think that our students remember that we covered a particular topic last week, but they may have had several courses and classes since then, and they don't necessarily see the big picture that you can see. So in a learning management system, you can link to the other resources that you shared with students before, or even just remind them that we covered this in week 3, for example. Also try to keep the content as relevant to the real world as possible. Give them tasks and problems to solve and examples that they will be able to understand. Try to align the assessments with learning outcomes. Quite often we create assessments that are convenient but are not necessarily always aligned with the learning outcomes we have for the course. Start off with simple tasks and then they can become more complex as the learners progress. Try to be flexible, particularly when you're talking about online learning. People have different technology, infrastructures available to them. People have different broadband, Wi-Fi access. People have other commitments when they're studying online and so on. And also provide templates if you can, particularly if you're asking students to do something that's not something they might have done before, like write a proposal, for example. They might not know what kind of a format you're expecting from them. So try and facilitate that by giving them an outline of the key headings. Some other things to think about: try to give students choice in assignments. This is a very useful universal design for learning strategy. So, we might decide to give an essay assignment, but somebody who has reading difficulties or writing difficulties or might not be a native English speaker might struggle to write an essay about a topic, but they might be able to develop an excellent podcast about the topic or create an excellent poster presentation about the topic. So giving choice is a very good UDL strategy. Try to get your students to collaborate whenever possible. You might not be interested in peer grading, but you might be interested in peer review where students can give each other feedback, but it doesn't necessarily have to feed into the final grade. Also encourage students to develop other skills beyond the subject matter expertise. So if they have to write an essay, for example, they have to be able to search databases, find journal articles, decipher fake news from real news. They have to design a document that's aesthetically pleasing and so on, and try to reward those other skills that they have developed. Encourage individual initiative and development as well as the collaborative aspect. Online courses shouldn't be 100% collaborative. Not everybody succeeds in that environment. Sometimes you'll be placed in a group that maybe not everybody is performing to the best of their abilities, and students don't like losing out on grades because they've been put in with a poor group. So allow for individual initiative as well. Make sure you clearly communicate to students how you're going to grade them, the breakdown of the grades. Give students opportunities to submit drafts if possible. This can be very challenging in a short semester because you have to give feedback on the drafts, but consider giving maybe a smaller version of the assignment for the draft so you can give them some preliminary feedback. So I have a podcast assignment where they have to create a 10 to 15 minute podcast, but in the draft, I only ask for 2 minutes of the podcast, and I can comment on the major areas they need to work on in that draft. Also consider giving marks for students' collaboration in discussion forums. It can be difficult to get students to engage, but if there's a couple of percent going for it, you're more likely to get them to engage. And also consider when you give students a task to do, maybe give them another task to do, which is to reflect on that task. Okay, it could be in a reflective blog assignment, for example. Okay, so they're just some simple instructional design and universal design strategies that you can employ. Quite often people ask me, how do you assess online participation? Quantitatively, you can do very simple things quite easily with your learning management system. So if you use Blackboard or Moodle or Canvas, you will have access to analytics about each student. So such as how often they logged on, how many words they wrote, how many postings they made and so on. So that could be your simple way of determining how frequently they engaged. Or you might want to do something more advanced. You might want to look at the messages individually and see how they match up with the context in which they were posted. Did the student answer the question? Does the student show evidence of cognitive or social presence? So Garrison and his colleagues, they have developed a number of indicators that you can look out for in students' forum postings to see if they have actually shown evidence of this cognitive and social presence. And then if you're really adventurous and you have some artificial intelligence or machine learning skills, you might like to use something like decision tree classification to assess how students performed, what they did and what they didn't do. Okay. People also ask me, how do you choose tools? Because there are so many tools out there, and the tools that exist this year, some of them won't even exist next year. So rather than focus on which tool I must use, focuses instead on the pedagogy. Think about the learning outcomes you're trying to achieve, and then see if there are some tools out there that can help you achieve those learning outcomes. It might be that technology cannot help in that situation, but quite often it can. But you also need to think about what level of skills, what levels of ICT literacy people have in terms of your own skills and also your student skills. Like if it's a complicated tool, they'll need training on how to use it. Also think about how much interaction is required using those tools. Do you need them to be live, collaborative tools, or can they be asynchronous tools like a discussion forum, for example? Think about what tools are already available to your students and to yourself. Your learning management system might have some very useful tools that you can use easily without having to purchase new licenses and install new applications. And also think about when and how you're going to provide feedback to your students. So usually I categorize the tools into these kind of major categories here. There are many more categories of tools, but if you have a combination of maybe private reflective blogging, you have some collaborative forums and chat rooms, maybe webinars, you have students sharing documents and images and videos and doing presentations online, that's a really healthy selection of tools. And I have lots more tools and categories of tools on my own website, and also you'll find them on Heart's website as well. Okay. The second thing I want to talk to you about briefly is how to deliver and how to evaluate your online course. So when we teach online, we're not just a teacher. We also need to have other skills. And e-moderating is a kind of a skill in itself. This is where you have to do extra things beyond just teaching your students, because there is technology between you and your audience of learners. Okay? So an e-moderator has to do lots of extra things. They have to set up online forums. They have to explain to students how to communicate and behave appropriately in an online space. They have to watch out for problems that might not be as obvious in the online space as they would be in a physical classroom. And you need to be able to intervene appropriately and so on. So one way that you can develop your e-moderating skills is by using Gilly Salmon's 5-stage model of teaching and learning. So this model here, I'll just briefly outline it here, but I have the references there for those of you who want to learn more about it. Learners typically go through these 5 stages of learning, and the amount of interactivity varies depending on the stage they're at. But it's important to emphasize that learners can go through this in leaps and bounds. So some learners might still be struggling at the access stage. They might just be getting used to the online learning platform. They might just be trying to build some confidence speaking to other people online. And other students could be up solving problems and doing the assignments. And you have to try and manage all of that remotely. Okay, so Gilly Salmon's model gives you very useful guidelines for each of those stages. But another thing you can think about are using Gilly Salmon's e-tivities, which are structured forum-based e-tivities. And these are not necessarily just about discussion topics and debate topics. You can devise an e-tivity that gets students to do science experiments, to debate topics, to do anything possibly. Okay, so you can look at some examples of them in Gilly Salmon's book and also on my website, but I find them really excellent for lots of different types of activities. So just to give you a feeling for this, these are different types of e-tivities I've used myself, and some of my colleagues have used as well. So I have icebreaker e-tivities that get students to log into the platform and get to know one another. I have e-tivities that get students to form groups, pick their roles, design interfaces. And my colleagues have developed e-tivities where you get students to watch a TED talk and then comment on it, in the context of whatever they're studying and so on. And I have loads more examples of e-tivities on my website that you can take a look at and adapt as you need to. Okay. When you're evaluating an online course, there's a number of things to think about. So I'm just touching on one model here, or one framework to consider. First of all, you want to ask your students overall, what's their perception of the overall online course experience? Okay. But you also want to delve in more deeply into other aspects. So look at the course materials you made available and how you orientate the learner to your course. Do you provide a syllabus overview that's easily accessible? Do you have a nicely structured learning management system that tells students what they have to do each week? Does it have checklists and pointers and guidelines? Look at the course content itself. Have you given them too much, too little? What kind of quality is it? Is the information design appropriate? Is it nicely presented to students and clearly, articulated? Is it legible, and so on? Also look at the levels of interaction between students and also between the student and the instructor. Is it appropriate? Is it too much? Is there not enough? Also get students to self-assess their participation and performance in the course. Okay, did students help other students learn? Did they share resources with one another? Also look at the technology you used. Okay, was it easy to use? Were students able to find the resources they needed on the learning management system? Okay, did you design it properly so that they could easily access things? Look at the levels of technical support that were available. Maybe it was you who provided all the technical support, or maybe somebody else provided it, like your IT department. And also, did your students have access to all the kinds of course materials they might need? E-books, journal articles, and so on, especially as they're remote students. And then just to conclude, I want to briefly touch on some best practice guidelines for teaching and learning online. I would recommend that you involve everybody involved in the course in the design of the course. Okay, and that includes library staff, tutors, as well as the lecturers. Make sure all your decisions are informed by learning outcomes, aligning the activities with those learning outcomes. Use synchronous delivery if you need to facilitate two-way interaction. If it's just you presenting to an audience, then it doesn't need to be synchronous. Try to reuse some of your materials, like your grading rubrics and your learning objects. Try to give some marks for online participation. Talk to your colleagues about what works and what doesn't work. Reflect on what you've done and evaluate it and modify it if necessary. Try to get your students to engage on a weekly basis, and that means more than just reading your lecture materials. Get them to participate in forums and other activities. Get students to collaborate and review each other's work. Think about universal design for learning, making your content accessible, usable. Think about different learning styles and preferences, and give students enough guidance in terms of templates, grading rubrics. Tell them how to communicate effectively online. And finally, try to give small group support if you can. Okay, if you have a tutor who can help you with your module, that's great. Try not to give too much information. So just because you can link to 20 different documents online doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. Be careful about your expectations. Communicate them clearly to students, what you will do and when, and what they should do and when. Make sure your learning management system, your site, is properly organized. Turn off tools that you're not using. Don't use tools just for the sake of it. They should have some pedagogical value. Try to only experiment with 1 or 2 tools at a time. If you're using something new, make sure you explain to students how to use those tools, and always have a backup plan for technology, because technology might let you down sometimes. Make sure you log in regularly yourself to create an online teaching presence. I would recommend doing it at least once per weekday, but maybe once in the morning, once in the afternoon. That means the messages won't build up too much and you can deal with problems as they arise. And I would also recommend having a live chat session, maybe once per week, where you're available in a Microsoft Teams environment or in the live chat in the learning management system. And also try to use the learning management system consistently across all the modules in the program. That helps students to become more familiar with the environment quickly, and they can focus on the content rather than on the inconsistencies of your interface. Okay, so that's just a very quick overview of some best practice guidelines for teaching in a blended and online environment. I have all my references here at the end of my slides, and I'm happy to share them with you, after this presentation if you find that of use. Thank you for listening to my presentation.